It was all simple in the beginning. The year 2024. The place 53 years later. Withholding tax was imposed on income generated by non-residents, providing services to Saudi Arabian business entities. In 2017, excise tax was introduced and imposed on specific goods. One year later, in 2018, a value-added tax was introduced. VAT is an indirect tax imposed on goods and services. As we go, the journey of taxation went from being easy to collect to a much broader and more complex that presented greater difficulties for compliance, assessment, and collection. More recently, the cloud of the digital economy has presented new challenges to tax systems with the involvement of multiple parties, each in a different country. The digital economy is growing at an accelerated rate, carrying amazing opportunities, contributing to the international development of financial sustainability, along with its own challenges to the zakat and tax systems.
ضيوفنا الكرام نستمع الآن لكلمة معالي وزير المالية ورئيس مجلس إدارة العامة للزكاة والدخل الأستاذ محمد الجدعان.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will speak in Arabic, so for those who are unable to understand Arabic, please use headsets. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدني أن أرحب بكم جميعا في افتتاح الدورة الأولى لمؤتمر الزكاة والضريبة الذي تنظمه الهيئة العامة للزكاة والدخل في إطار جهودها لتطبيق أفضل الممارسات في القطاعين الزكوي والضريبي بالمملكة. كما يسرني أن أعرب عن سعادتي بحضور هذه النخبة المتميزة من القيادات المحلية والإقليمية والدولية والخبراء المختصين في الإدارات الضريبية والزكوية. الإخوة والأخوات، يأتي انعقاد هذا المؤتمر للمرة الأولى في ظل عدد من التحديات التي تواجه الاقتصاد العالمي، وتتطلب من الدول بذل المزيد من الجهود للحفاظ على الاستقرار المالي ودعم النمو الاقتصادي. كما يأتي انعقاد المؤتمر وبلادنا تشهد تحولا اقتصاديا واجتماعيا بقيادة خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك سلمان بن عبد العزيز وسمو ولي عهده الأمير محمد بن سلمان بن عبد العزيز حفظهم الله، لتحقيق تنويع اقتصادي ونمو مستدام في إطار رؤية المملكة 2030 التي بدأت تؤتي ثمارها من خلال النتائج الملموسة لتنويع مصادر الدخل والآثار الإيجابية للإصلاحات المالية والاقتصادية التي تواصل تنفيذها حكومة المملكة، والتي منها تطوير القطاعين الزكوي والضريبي. الحفل الكريم. عملت حكومة المملكة العربية السعودية خلال السنوات الماضية على تطوير المالية العامة ومراجعة كافة الأنظمة والتشريعات لتواكب التطورات والمتغيرات الاقتصادية المحلية والدولية، والعمل على تحقيق مستهدفات برامج الرؤية وانضباط الصرف وتنظيم الإيرادات وتطوير التشريعات والسياسات المساعدة في رفع جودة الأداء لتحقيق الاستدامة المالية، وهو الأمر الذي تطلب تطبيق إصلاحات مالية وهيكلية خلال السنوات الماضية لتنويع مصادر الدخل، بالإضافة للخطط والمبادرات التي تنفذها الحكومة لتنويع القاعدة الاقتصادية، لتتيح فرصاً أكبر أمام القطاع الخاص للاستثمار وخلق المزيد من الوظائف، وبالتالي نمو الناتج المحلي الإجمالي غير النفطي على المدى المتوسط، والتقدم في التحول الاقتصادي وفقا لرؤية المملكة 2030. وقد أظهر البيان التمهيدي للميزانية العامة للدولة للعام المالي 2020 توجهات السياسة المالية التي ستنعكس في ميزانية العام المقبل والمدى المتوسط، والتي تعمل على تحقيق التوازن بين أهداف النمو الاقتصادي واستمرار الحفاظ على الاستدامة المالية من خلال إطار مالي واقتصادي متسق، والتركيز على رفع كفاءة الإنفاق واستمرار الإنفاق على البرامج المحفزة والمساندة والممكنة للقطاع الخاص، وبما يساهم أيضاً في تنمية الإيرادات العامة وإيجاد مصادر تتسم بالتنوع والاستمرارية للحد من تذبذب التدفقات النقدية، الأمر الذي يمكننا من التخطيط المالي الجيد وتخفيف آثار تقلبات أسعار النفط، بالإضافة إلى تحقيق الأهداف الاقتصادية المختلفة. وقد بدأت الإجراءات والإصلاحات المالية تؤتي ثمارها، حيث ارتفعت الإيرادات غير النفطية خلال السنوات الثلاث الماضية من 166 مليار في عام 2015 إلى 294 مليار في العام 2018، وبمتوسط نمو سنوي بلغ 21%. ومكنت هذه المبادرات الحكومية من تنفيذ وتمويل العديد من المشاريع التنموية التي ساهمت في تعزيز النمو الاقتصادي. كما انعكست هذه الجهود في تعزيز مكانة المملكة وتنامي الثقة في متانة اقتصادها، سواء من البنك الدولي أو صندوق النقد الدولي وغيرها من المؤسسات الدولية، كما اعتلت المملكة المركز الأول ضمن قائمة أفضل الدول من حيث التحسن في سهولة ممارسة الأعمال خلال هذا العام، بالإضافة لتحسن مركز المملكة 30 درجة لتحل في المركز 62 على المستوى الدولي ضمن مؤشر سهولة الأعمال، كما تقدمت المملكة 21 مرتبة في مؤشر دفع الضرائب. الحضور الكريم، تستهدف السياسة الضريبية في المملكة تحقيق التوازن بين الأهداف المالية والاقتصادية للدولة، حيث تراعي الحفاظ على الاستدامة المالية في المدين المتوسط والطويل، وبما يضمن تحفيز معدلات النمو الاقتصادي، إدراكاً منا بأن السياسات المالية سواء على جانب الإيرادات أو النفقات تشكل أحد أهم محركات النمو في القطاع غير النفطي، وهنا تكمن أهمية التوازن في عملية التخطيط المالي بين حجم الإيرادات الممكن تحقيقها وما يقابله من قدرة على الإنفاق على الأنشطة والقطاعات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية المستهدفة. وفي جانب التطبيق، تستهدف الحكومة وبنفس القدر من الأهمية أن تتسم الإدارة الضريبية بالوضوح والسهولة واستخدام أحدث التقنيات والنظم المعلوماتية لرفع كفاءة التحصيل وتقليل التكاليف والإجراءات التي قد تعيق النشاط الاقتصادي. إن الإصلاحات الضريبية التي تم تطبيقها خلال الأعوام الماضية ربطت الإيرادات الضريبية بشكل وثيق بأداء النشاط الاقتصادي غير النفطي، وتحقق ذلك بتناسق الأهداف المالية والاقتصادية، فكلما ارتفعت معدلات نمو هذا النشاط كلما ارتفعت الحصيلة الضريبية، كما نلمسه خلال العام الحالي ومن خلال أداء المؤشرات الاقتصادية الفعلية. الإخوة والأخوات، تشكل الهيئة العامة للزكاة والدخل جزءاً مهماً من عناصر إدارة السياسة المالية، كما هو متعارف عليه في الاقتصاديات الأخرى. وقد استوجب دور الهيئة في ظل التحول الذي تشهده المملكة إعادة تشكيل مهام خدمات الزكاة والضريبة، بما في ذلك آلية العمل واستخدام الأتمتة والرقمنة، وأصبحت خدمة المكلفين ضمن أهم أهدافها. وقد انعكس ذلك على حجم المسؤولية الملقاة على عاتق الهيئة العامة للزكاة والدخل التي تتولى جباية الزكاة وتحصيل الضريبة وتعمل على تطوير أنظمة الزكاة والضرائب، ويشمل ذلك تطوير آليات حساب الزكاة والضرائب للقطاعات المتخصصة مثل القطاع المالي، وتسهيل إجراءات حساب وتحصيل الزكاة للمنشآت الصغيرة والمتوسطة من خلال توفير أنظمة محاسبية وحلول تقنية لإجراء القيود المحاسبية وإعداد الإقرارات الضريبية، إذ أن الإيراد الزكوي والضريبي يرتبط بشكل مباشر بنمو هذه المنشآت. ولقد أثمرت هذه الجهود عن صدور اللائحة التنفيذية لجباية الزكاة وقواعد حساب زكاة أنشطة التمويل، وقرار تحمل الدولة للزكاة وضريبة الدخل عن الاستثمار في الصكوك والسندات الحكومية، وقواعد حساب زكاة مكلف التقديري، وذلك لتحسين إجراءات تحصيل الزكاة بما يحقق أعلى درجات الالتزام والكفاءة وزيادة الشفافية والوضوح، الأمر الذي سينعكس على جذب الاستثمار وزيادة ثقة المستثمرين. كما أثمرت الجهود المبذولة خلال العامين الماضيين تحقيق عدد من المنجزات، منها توسيع نطاق ضريبة السلع الانتقائية وتحسين وتعزيز تجربة المكلفين، وتوسيع تغطية نطاق الخاضعين لضريبة القيمة المضافة. كما تحرص الهيئة على تفعيل اتفاقيات منع الازدواج الضريبي والتي تم توقيعها مع أكثر من 50 دولة، وهي اتفاقيات ستنعكس إيجاباً على قطاع الأعمال وتعطي مزيداً من الثقة فيما يخص انتقال رؤوس الأموال والاستثمارات العالمية. ومن المهم الإشادة بتجربة المملكة في تطبيق ضريبة القيمة المضافة الذي طبق في زمن قياسي، إذا استغرق الإعداد وتحضير الأدوات النظامية واللوائح والتجهيزات التقنية والإدارية لتلك المبادرة حوالي 8 أشهر، وتجاوزت نسبة الالتزام جميع التقديرات التي وضعت سواء من قبل الهيئة أو بعض المنظمات الدولية، إذ تجاوزت هذه النسبة 90%، في حين كانت التقديرات ما بين 60 و 70%. كما بلغت الإيرادات المحققة من ضريبة القيمة المضافة حوالي 47 مليار ريال في أول عام من التطبيق، ما شكل ارتفاعاً عن ما كان مقدراً لها في ميزانية السنة المالية. ولأن الثروة البشرية هي مفتاح النجاح لأي عملية تنموية، فقد حرصت الهيئة على تأهيل الكوادر الوطنية لإثراء هذا القطاع الحيوي، ومن ذلك ما نشهده اليوم من خلال تدشين أكاديمية الهيئة العامة للزكاة والدخل التي تساهم في تدريب وتطوير الكفاءات الوطنية في قطاعي الزكاة والضرائب، ونعول أن تساهم هذه الأكاديمية في نقل المعرفة وتأهيل الكوادر لدول الجوار والمنطقة العربية كذلك. الحضور الكرام، في الوقت الذي سيناقش فيه مؤتمر الزكاة والضريبة التحديات التي تواجه هذين القطاعين، فإن الاقتصاد الرقمي يشهد تطورات متسارعة، وإننا نتطلع إلى أن تسهم التقنيات الحديثة مثل الذكاء الاصطناعي وتقنية سلسلة الكتل الموزعة أو ما يسمى بالبلوك تشين في تحسين الامتثال للزكاة والضريبة وإثراء قطاع الأعمال وخفض التكلفة وتعزيز الشفافية الضريبية وتطوير الأنظمة الضريبية للتجارة الإلكترونية وإحداث تحولات جوهرية في إدارة الضرائب. كما نتطلع إلى أن تسهم فعاليات هذا المؤتمر في فتح آفاق للتعاون وتبادل الخبرات بما يحقق نقلة نوعية في إدارة هذين القطاعين الزكوي والضريبي. الحفل الكريم في إطار رئاسة المملكة الدورة المقبلة لمجموعة 20 بدءا من ديسمبر المقبل، فإنها تعمل على الوصول إلى حل توافقي لمواجهة التحديات الضريبية الناتجة عن الاقتصاد الرقمي، والمساهمة مع باقي الدول الأعضاء في العمل على تحقيق الاستقرار في الاقتصاد العالمي واتباع السياسات والمبادرات التي تسهم في دفع معدلات النمو العالمية في صالح اقتصاداتنا وتحقيق تطلعات شعوبنا وخلق السياسات والإجراءات الداعمة للنمو الاقتصادي. وفي ضوء ذلك تستند مناقشات هذا المؤتمر فيما يتعلق بالأولويات الضريبية الدولية وجهود الشفافية الضريبية إلى عدد من التقارير التي أعدتها منظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية لمجموعة العشرين، والتي توضح الأولويات والمتطلبات الضريبية لدولها، وكذلك القضايا المتعلقة بأهداف المجموعة والتي من شأنها الإسهام في استقرار الاقتصاد العالمي. في الختام أود أن أشكر الزملاء في الهيئة على هذه المبادرة بإقامة هذا المؤتمر، وكل من شارك في تنظيم هذا الحدث المهم، وجميع الضيوف الذين يشاركوننا في هذا المؤتمر. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
ضيوفنا الكرام، تحرص الهيئة العامة للزكاة والدخل على تطوير موظفيها ورفع كفاءة الأداء، ولهذا عزمت الهيئة على إطلاق أكاديمية للتدريب والتطوير. ندعو معالي وزير المالية لتدشين أكاديمية الزكاة والدخل. يتفضل الآن معالي محافظ الهيئة العامة للزكاة والدخل المهندس سهيل بن محمد أبانمي بحضور مراسم توقيع مذكرة التفاهم مع منظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية OECD. وأيضا يحضر معالي المحافظ مراسم توقيع مذكرة التفاهم مع أكاديمية مسك. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll start the first session in this conference. And it's an in-conversation between Pascal Saint-Amans, the director of OECD, Center for Tax Policy and Administration, and Mr. Martin Greenbaum, the Director General, International Taxation Chairman Committee on Fiscal Affairs, Federal Ministry of France, Germany. Sorry, Federal Ministry of Finance, Germany.
Good morning to you all, and let me start by thanking our Saudi Arabian hosts for organizing this important conference and for inviting us to participate. I'm still impressed by the venue here, the very impressive conference room. I'm impressed by the large audience, the number of delegates, more than 1,000 I heard, which is quite unusual compared to conferences we normally hold in Germany, on taxation at least. And I'm also impressed by the list of topics to be covered today and tomorrow in our discussions. So this conference, I think, comes at the right time. We are discussing for the first time among more than 130 countries and jurisdictions fundamental changes in international tax law. And the positive message is, to begin with, is that there is a continuing broad consensus that fair taxation needs internationally coordinated solutions. Everybody believes in the merits and benefits of international coordination when it comes to taxation. Unlike in other political areas, in international taxation, we need an international coordination because we need to avoid double taxation. We also would like to avoid double non-taxation, as we have agreed under the BEPS 1 program, and we have agreed on standards, definitions for harmful tax practices to distinguish, to identify harmful tax practices and to distinguish them from non-harmful tax practices. So tax competition needs a framework, and this is the right setting to discuss this framework. Pascal, how do you see things developing at the OECD level?
Thank you, Martin, and good morning to you all. And before responding to your question, Your Excellency, Minister, commissioners, and dear friends, extremely happy to be here. The governor of Zakat was just telling me when I was telling him how impressed I was by the attendance that we are thirsty. We are thirsty in this region of learning about what's going on in tax. Very active Zakat, very active finance ministry, and very active program for taxation. So the OECD is very happy to be present here. Indeed, as Martin said, the international tax agenda is pretty broad, extremely active, very rich, and things are moving fast. The G20 presidency that Saudi Arabia will take over in a few weeks will probably have tax pretty high on its agenda, as the minister said a number of times to his colleagues and to the world. And I think that reflects what Martin has just indicated, that tax cooperation has become the rule. For decades, you had separate sovereignties interacting at minima through tax treaties, and now we have broad tax cooperation. And the inclusive framework, as well as the global forum, but the inclusive framework on BEPS implementation, with now its 135 members, if I'm not mistaken, is the right place to have this coordination, which is a way to make sure that tax competition doesn't become harmful, and that there are a number of common rules to ensure the elimination of double taxation, to ensure that there is no what we call double non-taxation and to make sure that we increase tax certainty. But I would like to bounce the question back to the chair on how he sees the political support. We talked about the G20, we could see the same on the G7. We can see in the region a lot of appetite for a discussion on tax, and more broadly, how do you see, Martin, the political support for advancing on tax matters and in particular on the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy?
Yeah, we have seen that this year that we received, the Inclusive Framework, received a strong political backing from different organizations, in particular from the G20 in summer this year, where the finance ministers and then later on also the heads of states and governments agreed on the work program that the OECD and the Inclusive Framework had produced in earlier this year, in spring of this year, on the taxation of the digital economy, including two pillars, the allocation of taxing rights and also the second pillar on minimum taxation. And the G20 leaders, they have backed this, this program politically, which is enormously important for the international discussion process. And you see it also in other regions in the world. For example, where I'm from Europe, there is also a strong consensus that we need to move forward on a multilateral basis. We had a discussion on the taxation of the digital economy, and the Commission in Europe had prepared a directive proposal only 1.5 years ago, where the finance ministers then decided in Europe to wait for a multilateral international solution that goes beyond Europe and includes all countries in the world. So this shows that there is significant political backing on our work.
And if there is political backing, there is a top-down approach. Ministers, governments expect the tax people to deliver. Now, the challenge we are facing, the chair of the CFA, the Committee on Fiscal Affairs and the Inclusive Framework is facing, as well as the Secretariat, is how we build consensus from there. Because if there is agreement that we need to address the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy, if there is agreement, or if there was agreement and still is agreement on the importance of fighting base erosion and profit shifting, on implementing the rules which were developed, there may not yet be agreement on how to build consensus. And something which is obvious to us because that's our daily work, but which may not be obvious to everybody, is that the rules we develop by consensus. Consensus meaning that there is agreement as long as nobody no longer objects to what is proposed. And what we need to work out now is how can we get consensus on both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of these tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy, meaning bringing together countries as different, with so different interests as the United States of America, or Asian countries like Japan, Korea, or developing countries like African countries. ATAF is present here, which represent largely the views of African countries, or India and the G24, or Saudi Arabia, which is now moving in the field of direct taxation with its own view of the world and its own interests. So the question, Martin, is on Pillar 1, how do you see emerging? What are the main features where you think consensus can be reached in the coming months?
Yeah, first of all, Pascal, I would fully agree with you that we are dealing with a very heterogeneous group of countries. So we have, within the group of 135 member states of the Inclusive Framework, we have developing countries, emerging countries, developed countries, small jurisdictions, larger economies, financial hubs, and we need to arrive at a balanced solution in the end. And as far as Pillar 1 is concerned, we are talking about, to a certain extent, about a reallocation of taxing rights, where market jurisdictions or jurisdictions where the consumer or the user of certain business models is located will be given more taxing rights than they have nowadays. So this is something, I think, which is a consensus, that we talk about a reallocation to a certain extent based on user participation in market jurisdictions, maybe also based on the exploitation of marketing intangibles. We need to be very clear on that narrative, why it is that we allocate taxing rights or more taxing rights to market jurisdictions. That needs to be very clear from the narrative, but I think everybody is in agreement with the fact that we talk about an allocation of taxing rights to market jurisdictions. How do we do that? That is, from a technical point of view, still difficult, but it all starts with a narrative that needs to be translated in a mechanic, in an architecture that would then give market jurisdiction taxing rights to, that would give taxing rights to market jurisdictions. I think there everybody agrees. The technique is quite complicated, and there's a lot of work to be done, and nobody knows better than you, Pascal, how complicated that work is. Then we also need to talk about other design features, including the so-called nexus question. So what are the conditions under which a given market jurisdiction would be entitled to tax certain income? That threshold also needs to be discussed. So on the building blocks, I think in principle there's a broad agreement. How we fill that out, what the mechanic is, what the architecture will be, that is still under discussion. And Pascal, you know best how far we have progressed. The Secretariat supports this discussion and does an enormous work on the fundamental underlying also mechanical and technical and legal issues.
Thank you. Well, you may have seen something which is a bit unusual in the OECD process, that before the G20 finance ministers meeting a few weeks ago in Washington, the Secretariat of the OECD and of the Inclusive Framework, with its large membership, issued a proposal. Secretariat words don't matter much, because what matters is consensus. But at some point, because of the different views which had been expressed and which didn't seem to converge, we thought, as the Secretariat, with my Secretary General Angel Gurria, that it was time to try to bring everybody together and to make a proposal. So our proposal, which was tabled, is about a scope which is about consumer facing, but that's just a proposal for the member countries to discuss. It's about a nexus, which would be a threshold of sales and a new nexus for taxing companies, and then a new rule for the allocation of taxing right, introducing something quite fundamentally new, which would be a portion of the residual profit of companies allocated to market jurisdictions, plus introducing a fixed rate of return for distribution activities, and wrapping all this up with tax certainty by effective and binding dispute resolution mechanism. So this is on the table, and now it's in the hands of member countries, and I can tell you that it's crunch time. We're having steering group meetings of the inclusive framework, very animated, very interesting, but the goal here is to be able to move this forward. We'll draw on the public consultation, which is happening right now. Next week in Paris, there will be a meeting with all the people who will have commented on the draft. And then we'll try to move this forward to the inclusive framework at the end of January to see whether an outline, an agreement can be agreed, so that we could prepare a full agreement on a political solution by June. This is what we promised to the minister for the G20 finance ministers in July, and we hope that members will be able to converge there, but things are not yet done. But Martin, I know that not only as the chair of the CFA, but as the German delegate, there is another pillar which you are extremely interested in. So maybe you would like to say a few words about pillar 2 of this work.
Yeah, of course. But Pascal, let me first also focus on one aspect you mentioned, and that is tax certainty. And you might recall that Germany, under its G20 presidency back in 2017, focused on two main issues under the tax track, one of which was at that time already the revitalization of action item 1, which is the taxation of the digital economy, and the other one was tax certainty. So that has always played a big role, tax certainty for businesses, tax certainty for investments, absolutely important, and has been a priority on the G20 agenda since. So this was important for us to introduce that topic and to add it to the G20 political agenda under the tax track, and it remained to be a priority until today, and it still plays a big role also in the context of the taxation of the digital economy. On Pillar 2, as Pascal said, Germany, together with a co-sponsor, which is France, introduced a proposal to address the challenges of the digital economy, of the taxation of the digital economy, and the proposal is to introduce a worldwide minimum taxation, a minimum effective taxation. We fully agree that countries remain sovereign in setting their tax rates, so this is not a discussion on limitation of tax sovereignty of countries. I think that is very important to realize in that context, but we also see that in particular in the digital economy, sources for income, sources for revenue can easily be shifted to other jurisdictions, so in some cases it becomes arbitrary where you shift your revenue source to. And this is in particular true for the digital economy because the digital economy relies very much on intangibles, on intangible assets, which can easily be shifted to other jurisdictions. So therefore we think a worldwide minimum taxation, a mechanism that would give countries an ability, an instrument at hand to react to low tax jurisdictions, low tax situations would be very important. And it is so important because we need an internationally coordinated mechanism to react to low tax situations. We see already countries in the world that have introduced, for example, the United States, a sort of minimum taxation with the GILTI system and the BEAT system. And those systems need to be coordinated to avoid double taxation, also in the broader context of avoiding double taxation and giving tax certainty for business investments. So we would be looking at effective tax situations in other countries and have developed a mechanism to respond to those effective tax situations, and we would cover inbound and outbound situations. So the model is quite comprehensive and would then safeguard an international minimum taxation. And also here the OECD is being extremely helpful in supporting this idea. And as we have seen in the international political process, we have received a strong backing also from the G20, also on Pillar 2.
Thank you. Maybe before concluding, a couple of remarks. One is all this work on the digitalization of the economy is just an extension of what was done on BEPS. It's not necessarily fighting base erosion and profit shifting. I think it's more fundamental. It's about the reallocation of taxing right, but clearly this is the continuation of Action 1 report from the BEPS action plan. All that to say that there is this tax certainty dimension, which is very important, but more recently, emphasis has been put on the tax administrability of the measures. I can see a few tax commissioners in the first row, and I think they care about how they can administer solutions. And tax certainty will first come from the clarity of the rules, but also the administrability of the rules. If we have too complex rules, and the OECD has probably been too good at having too complex rules, so we need to do a better job there. We need to have rules which are clear and which are easy to administer. And the Forum on Tax Administration, which gathers more than 50 countries, 50 tax commissioners meeting regularly, will probably have its say on the design of the rules and how they can be further implemented. The other point I wanted to highlight is the inclusiveness of the inclusive framework and the fact that these rules must fit all countries, including developing countries. There is a policy issue here about the reallocation of taxing rights because the interests are not the same, and compromise must be done so that there is consensus and everybody will gain enough or not lose too big so that they can agree. But the development dimension is key. Domestic resource mobilization is a key pillar for the sustainable development goals, and these are not words. This is key. And I think even for Saudi Arabia, which is not a poor country, relying on tax more and more, and we could see this in the opening video, is something which is absolutely essential. So relying on domestic resource mobilization, meaning good tax policies and good tax administration, is something which is key. And that opens to the broader agenda of this conference, which is not only about international tax, but which is also about zakat for this country, but also about VAT, which was introduced successfully recently. So there is a broad agenda beyond direct taxation, and I think we all need to keep that in mind. So Martin, thank you very much. Maybe a last word for you.
Yeah, thank you, Pascal. Yeah, one point I'd like to stress, look, we are discussing today and tomorrow, because if we want to arrive at a consensus-based outcome, and if we want all 134 member states or 135 member states to agree to the outcome, everybody needs to be in a position to administer that outcome. And that means that we need to focus on capacity building, because the rule won't be easy to implement, won't be easy to administer. And if everybody would like to participate on an equal footing, we need to invest in capacity building. That is, in my view, one of the most important priorities on the international tax agenda when it comes to coordination of tax administration.
I can see we have a few more minutes than we had planned. So to try to wrap all this up, you can see that the hot topic of the day and probably of the year of 2020 will be about reaching consensus on a fundamental change to international tax rules with two dimensions. One is reallocation of taxing rights with a new nexus, and that deals with the digitalization of the economy, with the challenges which are not yet completely addressed within our working groups of determining the right scope so that it covers digital companies and goes probably broader because it's difficult to ring-fence digital companies, but also the new approach described and sponsored by the chair, which is about a minimum tax, a rule which would be pretty easy to implement and which would be kind of rough justice here with the idea of this minimum tax. So that's one clear dimension. The other one is the continuation of BEPS implementation, making sure that the multilateral instrument is not only signed, which is the case largely by more than 90 countries, but also ratified by all countries. This will put an end to treaty shopping, and this is extremely important if we want to limit the base erosion and profit shifting. But there are other rules there. I mean, the automatic exchange of information of tax ruling is one of them. Tax certainty, as the chair said. And there is also an opportunity with the work on digitalization to improve tax certainty through effective and binding dispute resolution mechanism, and probably improving dispute prevention mechanisms. We have ICAP, International Compliance Assurance Program, which I think is a good pilot program to improve dispute prevention. And finally, as the chair highlighted, we have capacity building, which is something extremely important for all the countries across the world. Maybe a last word, Chair, on the tax transparency that we have not touched upon, but which is key and still on the agenda of the G20. In 2 weeks' time, we will have the 10th anniversary of the Global Forum on Transparency, which is in the realm of the Committee on Fiscal Affairs and the work we collectively do with the G20. So maybe you would like to say a few words on the benefits coming and deriving from the tax transparency agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can really see the tax transparency agenda as a success story of the Global Forum on the one side and also of the inclusive framework, because in that broad area of tax transparency, we do not only cover exchange of information and exchange of information of financial accounts, automatic exchange of information. We also cover a lot of exchange of business information, not at least country by country reporting information that started to be exchanged last year. And countries now start to benefit from that information. It's still a work in progress because you need to implement that in your domestic tax administration, and you need to find ways and solutions how to best make use of the information you're receiving. But this is an enormous progress we have made over the last years. In particular, in Europe, we also introduced, on the basis of a European directive, which is binding for all member states, so all member states are bound to implement that directive into their domestic laws. We also exchange ruling information on a binding mechanism in Europe, and that also helps tax administrations to get information, tax-relevant information that is going on in other jurisdictions, and this will be exchanged and I think contributes significantly to tax certainty and also to tax fairness.
Good. Well, we thank you very much for being present today, and we look forward to the continuation of this extremely interesting and important conference a few weeks before Saudi Arabia takes over the presidency of the G20, and we as the OECD will be extremely happy to facilitate a significant agreement in 2020 under the leadership of the minister present here. Thank you very much.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, our second session is an in-conversation as well, titled Tax Transparency in the Digital Era. والآن أيها السيدات والسادة الكرام مع جلسة بعنوان مناقشة حول إصلاحات الشفافية الضريبية يتحدث فيها كل من زيدا مناتا رئيس أمانة المنتدى العالمي في مركز السياسة الضريبية والإدارة بمنظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية، والسيدة ماريا خوسيه غاردغار المدير العام للمديرية العامة للضرائب وزارة المالية الإسبانية. In this in-conversation session, Zaida Manatta, the head of the Global Forum Secretariat, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and Maria Jose Garde, the General Directorate of Taxation, Spanish Ministry of Finance.
Good morning. Good morning, and everybody, and thank you very much for this invitation to the Global Forum to participate in this event today and tomorrow. We are really grateful for Saudi Arabia to organize this conference on this topic that my colleagues said before is one of the main topics on the G20 tax agenda. So I think it will be good to discuss and to let you know who is the Global Forum and what is the main work we are doing worldwide. So between Zaida as head of Global Forum Secretary and myself as chair of Global Forum for this time, I would like to probably start with a brief introduction on who is the Global Forum, saying that it's a multilateral and it's an inclusive organization hosted by the OECD. It's a big organization dealing with transparency and exchange of information for tax purposes. We are by now 158 members, all working on equal footing, working together. And the main work of the Global Forum is to monitor the implementation of the standards of transparency and exchange of information. The Global Forum started working probably at the beginning of the 2000s, but it's true that in 2009 it was completely restructured, reestablished in its current form now. And actually we are celebrating the 10th anniversary in Paris in 2 weeks' time. We're happy to have the governor of GACT will attend our celebratory meeting. So thank you very much for joining us and celebrate this decade of work and of successful. So I think Saida is gonna maybe, how are we organizing this big event at the OECD in Paris?
Thank you, Maria Jose, and good morning all. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm also very impressed by the audience and by this amazing room. Thank you very much for organizing that and inviting us to be here. It's a pleasure to enjoy your hospitality here. Thank you. At our 10th anniversary that will take place in 2 weeks, we will be publishing a report on the main achievements of the Global Forum in these 10 years. It's a very successful story, what we have to tell. And as you probably know, there are two main international standards for exchange of information. One standard relates to exchange of information upon request, which means that when a country is verifying the compliance of a taxpayer, it can request information from another country to check the information that was provided by the taxpayers. And the other standard is automatic exchange of information, which means that the countries will are already receiving information on the financial accounts of its own taxpayers.
So both international standards. The first one I would like to refer the exchange of information on request. It was the first standard. All countries start exchanging information on request, as Saida said, is the main and the well-known standard because I mean probably all countries have already used that information to food the requests and audits at the tax administration. I mean, when we work in the tax administration, we know what that exchange of information request means. And when we back to the beginning of the work of the Global Forum in 2009, there were probably 2 or 3 main topics that were very probably worry countries as tax administration was bank secrecy. The other one was bear shares, and probably the third one would be the access to account information. So there were the 3 main topics and the 3 main issues that was on the agenda on the Global Forum and exchange and when reviewing the exchange of information on request. So from that time to now, 2009, 2019, 10 years, what happens on this standard and these 3 main blocks topics?
Yes, thank you for the question, because this is quite a successful story to tell. Almost 70 countries have changed their laws and regulations to guarantee full access to bank information with the aim of providing information to their partners. And this is quite successful and impact, and has a very strong impact in relationships between countries and in compliance, in taxpayer compliance. In addition, when it refers to bear shares, more than 30 countries have changed in their rules and regulations to also allow for either banish bear shares or immobilize these shares.
Thank you, Saida. And also, another key parameter that I would like to refer is not only how countries have changed their laws to accomplish the standard, but also, I mean, a successful story, it will be the number of requests have been, I mean, amazingly increased in the last 10 years. I mean, I have some numbers here, probably from 2009, we're talking about just 8,000 requests exchanged, but as far as I know, we are at least more than 200,000 requests. So that's a big successful of not the Global Forum, because we are not exchanging, but the tax administrations, countries are doing a lot of working very hard to accomplish all these standards, the exchange of information, requests, and all the mechanism. It's true that it's related to the number of agreements that have been finalized among countries. I mean, we're talking about from 3,000 and 8,000 bilateral relationships have amazingly increased in the last 10 years. But also, it's very interesting to explain how the Global Forum is monitoring the implementation of the standards. So maybe, Saida, you could explain how this implementation and how these reviews are of performance.
Yes, it's a peer review process. Countries are reviewed by their peers and also with the support of the Secretariat. And they are rated. They can get fully compliant rate, largely compliant, partially compliant, or non-compliant. And these rates help countries promote reforms, and it also helps the international community encourage countries to change their practice and their laws to comply with the standards. And in the coming years, one of the challenges the Global Forum will face is to ensure that countries do not fall back, do not come back to the old practice, and guarantee that the standards are kept at the level we have now, or even improve them. Another area of focus would be the beneficial ownership, because even now some countries are facing challenges to comply with this element. 1/3 of the countries that were reviewed and the beneficial ownership element were found partially compliant. So you can see it's an area where we need to work harder.
And also, let me highlight the importance of the ratings that the Global Forum issue to countries, because, I mean, from the G20, G20 also asked to the OECD to promote transparency in order to make a list of non-cooperative jurisdiction. Also, the European Union work on this area is helping, or is using the ratings that the Global Forum issue to countries to elaborate a non-compliance jurisdiction list. So one of the reasons that countries sometimes try to have better rates are because they don't want to be in that list. So it's quite challenging for Global Forum to work towards to better have issued the ratings. And another standard, I mean, the automatic exchange of information is the biggest. I don't know if it sounds. The most recent standard for exchange of information is the automatic exchange of information. I think we already mentioned the importance of this standard. In 2014, when some countries committed to the CRS, this exchange of financial accounts, I mean, it's almost 5 years since then, and how the Global Forum is dealing with this standard.
Yes, we have almost 100 jurisdictions, including Saudi Arabia, automatically exchanging financial information. We reviewed the countries. The legal framework was reviewed in the last years, And now from 2020, 2021, we will review the effectiveness of this exchange. It is a real game changer. Having access to information is a deterrent to non-compliance, but automatic exchange of information is really a game changer. It increases the risk of tax evaders to be caught. So it's a key milestone for the work of the Global Forum and the implementation of the exchange of information standards. Nowadays, if you go to a bank and you try to open an account and you are not a resident of these countries, they will request you a lot of information, and this information will be provided to your resident country. And the results we have seen are quite impressive, as taxpayers are feeling the risk to be caught, and they are voluntarily trying to comply with the tax laws. In the Global Forum anniversary, we will be disclosing and sharing some of the results that were achieved. But some countries have implemented voluntary disclosure programs with very impressive results.
So it's a very impressive standard, and I mean the effects of the implementation of this standard, we will see it in the next probably next couple of years. But taking into consideration that is in the exchange of automatic exchange of information, we have seen a lot of information. I mean, amazing data flowing from country to country. We have another risk there. It's a risk associated with security, confidentiality, and data protection. So I know the Global Forum is doing the best job there, reviewing countries, helping countries to ensure that the information, that this tax information, as in all countries are confidential, is still confidential when it's translated to other countries. And also, it's very important for the next couple of years, once we already started with the exchanging from 2017, 18, and 19, to ensure the effective implementation and how to control, monitor that effective implementation. So I see a lot of work there at the Global Forum for controlling and monitoring this effective implementation. How are we going to do it, Saida?
We're going to review peers, and we're also going to help countries to preserve the confidentiality. This is a challenge for any tax administration, to keep the confidentiality of the data. The hackers are more and more skilled, and we need to keep the pace with them to preserve the confidentiality of this information. And countries must also use the information, because at the first moment, the access to the information is a kind of a deterrent to non-compliance. But if the tax administration don't act, if they don't really use this information to show countries that what can be done and how they can use this information to challenge it, what the taxpayers are non-reporting, are actually trying to hide, the effect might be the opposite. So we really need to be able to use this information to promote compliance. And one of the challenges we face nowadays is to ensure that all the countries benefit from these standards and from the transparency agenda. The Global Forum has more than half of its members as developing countries, and it's imperative that we ensure these countries also benefit from the standards. We have a very ambitious technical assistance program, and it has helped countries to comply with the standards, to pass regulations, to pass new laws, to implement administrative framework so they can comply with the standards. This is an area that deserves attention and work.
And also, we have to remember that when we see the T20 tax agenda, we also can see this this topic about capacity building, developing countries. So that fits very well into the work that the Global Forum is doing with the developing country to facilitate so those countries can benefit from the effects, the benefits of the transparency. And taking to this point now, it's important to remark how transparency and exchange of information serves to I will say, an ultimate goal that is a fight against tax evasion and tax avoidance. Information is key for tax authorities to implement and to implement good and fair tax systems. I mean, when we are living in a global and open economy where business can move around and can easily do business wherever without physical presence, as we heard before, we need some kind of coordination and cooperation between countries so we can all together work for a fair system, tax system, so we can do that business and individuals pay taxes where they are due. So I think Global Forum, transparency and exchange of information serves to this ultimate and main goal of fair tax systems.
Yes, the world is changing and the challenges are different now. Besides guaranteeing that the standards are there, we should also keep the pace with the reforms. We have heard about digital economy and the challenges that countries are facing to deal with this new phenomenon and the impact they are having their own tax systems. And it's important that the exchange of information plays the role it should do in this context. I believe exchange of information will be very relevant to ensure that the framework that has been developed is fully implemented. And the Global Forum must keep agile to keep the pace with the reforms and with the new challenges. And only through coordinated and actions and a lot of cooperation, countries can really fight tax evasion and avoidance and ensure the fairness of their own tax systems.
So just for finish, to say thank you to the conference to give us just a small spot here to talk about transparency, because we really believe is one of the main topics on the tax agenda for the next couple of years. And maybe the transparency or the work of the Global Forum is not limited to automatic exchange of information on financial account or exchange of requests, because I think the agenda on transparency is wider than just CRS or on request. I mean, we know that the BEPS is bringing us more transparency, more standards that maybe we should take into consideration for the next couple of years. So thank you very much for all your attention, and again, thank you.
Yes, I would like to end with an invitation for all of you to either attend or follow us during the Global Forum anniversary in 2 weeks. It's going to be transmitted online, so I hope you follow us and follow the discussions that will take place there. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. And now we move on to a session titled An Update on G20 Tax Mandate. ننتقل بكم الآن إلى جلسة بعنوان آخر مستجدات المتطلبات الضريبية لمجموعة ال20. And the speakers for this session are Jeremy David Cape, a tax partner, Squire Patton Boggs. Muhannad Basatoun, Deputy Governor of Strategy and Transformation, General Authority of Zakat and Tax. Pascal Saint-Amaz, Director, OECD, Center for Tax Policy and Administration. Gail Piraud, Director of International Taxation, French Ministry of Finance. Takishiro Yasui, Deputy Vice Minister for International Tax Policy, Ministry of Finance, Japan.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to session 1, an update on the G20 tax mandate. It's been a while since I was last in Riyadh. Thank you again for making me feel so welcome, as well as the other panelists. Following the relative success of the BEPS project, initiated by G20 countries following the 2008 financial crisis, and brought to fruition by the OECD, focus has now shifted to taxation of the digitalized economy. Taxation of the digital economy was the subject of Action Point 1 of the BEPS project, but the OECD soon shifted focus to delivering results on other, generally simpler to achieve actions. The subtle shift from digital to digitalized was also an appreciation that reform isn't required and isn't desirable simply in relation to the so-called GAFA tech companies, being Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, but multinational business that exists outside the tech sector. This is because in 2019, almost all non-tech business is in some form digitalized. And if it isn't now, it will be in 2020. There's a lot to discuss. How can we balance the interests of governments, business, consumers, and civil society, to name but a few? How do we balance the interests of the developing and the developed world? How do we avoid creating uncertainty and an overwhelming compliance burden? And how do we design a new international tax regime that is as future-proof as possible? I'm delighted to say that we have 4 of the finest, most preeminent minds in the world of international tax on the panel today. We have Mohamed Basadan from Gazat here in Saudi Arabia. We have Pascal Saint-Amand, who's you've already heard from the OECD. We have Monsieur Gail Piraud from France, and we have Takehiro Yasui from the National Tax Agency in Japan. I'm going to go firstly to Yasui-san. You've got a short PowerPoint presentation you wish to share with us relating to the successes under the G20 presidency held by Japan in 2019. So over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everybody. I would like to first thank the organizer to invite me to this important conference, and it is my great pleasure and great honor to be here to make a presentation to you. This year, Japan has a presidency of G20, so that's why I'm here. I would like to explain a little bit about what is G20 and also the G20 tax agenda this year. I think I have a slide, and that slide could be there. Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you. First, I would like to speak a little bit about G20. As you know, I'm sure all of you already know what is G20. G20 is a group of 20 big countries, and at least once a year, the leaders of G20 countries get together to discuss the current important global issues. Under the G20 Leaders Summit, as you know, we have the finance track, which is finance ministers and the central bank governors meeting. In the finance track, the finance ministers are expected to discuss mainly the economic issues and also trade issues, the other issues. and they are expected to make a report to the leaders. So every year, the country of the presidency set the agenda in consultation with the other member countries. This year, Japanese presidency decided to focus on the three themes, as you see on the slide. The first one is a global economy, second one is robust economic growth, and third one is structural changes caused by innovation and globalization. Under this third topic, international taxation was discussed. Actually, this year, this international taxation and also the fintech, especially the stable coin, was a very big topic for the G20 finance ministers meeting. Oh, yes. I put some schedule of the whole year of the G20 finance ministers meeting on the slide. Finance ministers met 3 times in the last 12 months. 2 of them were at the margin of IMF and World Bank meeting in Washington, D.C. But the major one, the most important one, was held in June in Fukuoka. It's a south city of Japan. And also in June, at the margin of the finance ministers meeting, we organized ministerial symposium on international taxation in Fukuoka. Many finance ministers attended that symposium. Then I would like to move on to the international tax agenda. Japanese presidency gave a priority to the 4 issues you can see on the slide. Tax challenges arising from digitalization, implementation of the BEPS package, exchange of information, and assistance to the developing countries. As you see, all of the issues, we had important deliverables. The most of them are coming from OECD. Thank you for the OECD. One of the most important one is the first one, program work to develop a consensus-based solution to the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. This document was endorsed by G20 finance ministers in June, then by also the G20 leaders in June in Osaka. Finally, as you know, this month is the last month for Japan to be the G20 presidency, and the Saudi presidency will start next month. It's your turn. In practice, as you know, the G20 is steered by Troika, which is previous presidency, current presidency, and next presidency. So that means Japan will stay on Troika. So we are very much ready to cooperate with the Saudi authority for success of the Saudi presidency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Takehiro. That segues very nicely to Mr. Baston, who I'd like to go now. So you're taking over the G20 presidency from Japan in a few weeks, as was mentioned earlier. Can you explain how Saudi Arabia will look to build on the achievements of the G20 tax mandate, which were achieved under Japan, and in particular, how optimistic are you that the ambitious timetable can be achieved?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy, for your question. But before answering it, I have a brief statement in Arabic. Then I will be going back to it. السلام عليكم، حياكم الله جميعا في مؤتمر الزكاة والضريبة. نأمل أن يكون المؤتمر بإذن الله على مستوى التطلعات ويتجاوزها. أستميحكم عذرا بأن تكون المداخلة باللغة الإنجليزية نظرا لأن بقية المتحدثين من غير الناطقين بالعربية. So, going back to your question, Jeremy, I want to thank and welcome my fellow speakers, panelists, and participants for joining us at this conference. As we know, Saudi Arabia prepares to take over the G20 presidency in the upcoming few weeks. And addressing the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy is a priority for us. Countries need to reach an agreement by 2020, and we strongly support this objective. There has been significant progress made to achieve that solution, and and also in putting together a new framework to update the to update the foundations of the international tax system. This is with a view to addressing taxing rights and profit allocation, as well as further limiting the base erosion through a global minimum tax rate. However, much work is still needed to make the solution more solid and workable. Saudi Arabia welcomes and supports the work done so far on the unified approach and extends its full support to reach a consensus-based solution by 2020. Beyond the technical work required to advance the solution, political support is highly needed. And in order to make this project of a success, that political support is required. It requires G20 Saudi presidency will steer the digital taxation agenda with the inclusive framework and to make sure that we move towards a solution by 2020. The tax certainty agenda is important to promote a tax environment that is conducive to growth and responsible investment. We know that both tax authorities and taxpayers need it, and the international community has to continue supporting this agenda. Saudi Arabia is committed to enhance predictability for its own taxpayers. We launched the excise tax and the VAT tax regimes in 2017 and 2018. We have released a lot of detailed guidelines covering all industries to make sure that we make it clear and we enhance the certainty for the taxpayers for those new tax regimes. Also, we introduced a new transfer pricing regime, and the General Authority of Zakat and Tax indicated how it will approach that issue to avoid any misinterpretation and make compliance easier for taxpayers. This is also why we think that tax certainty will be very important in developing a solution on tax and digitalization, because a robust dispute mechanism, robust dispute resolution mechanism is highly needed in order to have a solid digital economy taxation solution. Additionally, the tax transparency agenda requires support to further enhance the volume, and safety of exchanging the information. We have worked on it ourselves here in Saudi Arabia, and we activated 65 bilateral exchanges with different countries, and we were assessed largely compliant by the OECD Global Forum on Transparency on the peer review report that was released yesterday. We also continue to encourage consistent implementation of the BEPS measures. G20 countries are not yet done with tackling tax avoidance, and we need to continue our efforts collectively. Also, Saudi Arabia also has moved and has signed the BEPS multilateral instrument in order to adjust its tax treaties. As you may know, Saudi Arabia, like other GCC countries, many G20 and non-G20 countries is going or undergoing a fundamental change and transformation on its tax administrations and tax instruments. We need to continue our work on this area, and we must reinforce the tax systems and be ready for the future. As you saw in the opening ceremony, Gazette and the OECD have signed an agreement to support Gazette Academy and to provide a high-quality training for the tax officials and administrations here in the region. And we believe this is a necessary step, as the tax cooperation is important in the international level, but is also fundamental in a regional level. High focus on capacity building is needed to ensure that the major benefits of the tax transparency standards and the BEPS package are available to developing countries. We know that improving domestic resource mobilization, as have been mentioned by Pascal and Martin in the first conversation, and tackling also illicit financial flows is a very important priority to other countries, and we will be working on that also during our presidency. This is why tax and development issues, as well as general support to developing countries, will be important to us.
Thank you. So we've had the Japanese and we've had the Saudi perspectives on the G20 mandate. I'd now like to go over to France, to Monsieur Perrault, to get your perspective on the G20 tax mandate, not just from a French perspective, but also, if you could, from an EU perspective. My country at the moment still remains a member of the EU for now, so you can talk on behalf of the British as well. And maybe let's get your perspective focusing on perhaps Pillar 2 and how you think that should play out over the coming year.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the Saudi hospitality. Speaking on behalf of the EU is maybe ambitious, but I will try. At least I will speak on behalf of my country, then I will be in agreement with myself. With regard to this process, we are very deeply committed to find a solution by 2020, and that's why, for instance, chairing the G7 group this year, we also work very closely with the Japanese presidency and put the digital taxation and more broadly now the tax reform high on the agenda. And I think it has been helpful to try to gather position among the developed country, bearing in mind that, of course, the proper fora to make those decisions is the inclusive framework, which is much bigger, and also the G20, which is also more inclusive than the G7. If we are so committed to find a solution in this area, it's because for us this issue goes back to 2012. It goes back to the origin of BEPS. And in this regard, Pascal said that it was an extension of BEPS. To me, it's rather back to the origin and try to really solve the issue we wanted to deal with at this period of time. And it's true that the initial feeling was that some MNEs were not playing on the same field than the other ones. And basically that's because also the economy is changing fast, while the rules are remained the same. They were built 100 years ago, and they were built to avoid double taxation. That's why countries accepted to limit their taxing rights or to share them. But those rules were mainly based on physical presence, and it was based at a period of time where profit was made mainly from tangible assets, so things you could really locate and see and know where they were. Now, today the value is more and highly driven by movable, intangible assets, so that's quite a change in the system. And this phenomenon has been exacerbated by the digital economy, and that explains why my country, but also European countries, are so keen in finding a solution to properly address the digital economy, because here the rules do not adequately fit with the reality of this new economy. But in the meantime, what is interesting is that we have already progressed in that discussion within the inclusive framework, taking into account the point of view of other countries. And finally, when I say that digital economy was exacerbating the phenomenon, we realized, and I think that my country has accepted it as a fact as well, that there was more than that in terms of dissatisfaction about how the system is functioning today. And we have different interested, but also different needs around the table, and therefore it's challenging, but maybe we have a stronger opportunity to fix things that rather than if we only target one sector, because here we have the opportunity to make something more robust, maybe more sustainable for the future, trying to take into account all the needs of the stakeholders around the table. On profit allocation, for instance, we have a demand which we cannot ignore from many countries to share the profit differently and to reward more than today what we call market activities and market countries. And it's true that more MNEs operate worldwide than before. So there is a validity in this argument that they make extra profit also on the fact that they operate worldwide and they operate on the markets. So I think that now, starting from the digital sector and moving to that area, many countries accept this fact, and the debate is how big is it, how limited is it if you take it differently, and also how do we conciliate that fact with maintaining the rules and the principle of the arm's length principle, because that's an important point for us, but for many countries as well, to keep that system and not to shift to another one, but to recognize that there is also a strong validity into rewarding the profit made locally. The second argument was more developed by developing countries, but I must say that it's shared by many countries, is the complexity of the current system. And I think here we have maybe the opportunity also to simplify some things and to reduce disputes, because with complexity we have more disputes. And that's why, for instance, we are also very open and interested into what we call the component B, which is another issue, which is more about how do you allocate profit for baseline distribution activities. But we think that is also the good opportunity to solve those many endless disputes that result in double taxation for many companies. So that's also a point. And also, of course, last but not least, we have a strong interest in the fact that this solution has to address a new nexus to address the digital issue, because we think that with the current rule based on physical presence, it's impossible to properly address this question. There is also, and sorry, I do not emphasize Pillar 2 as much, but I also participate to the third session, so if you want me to address Pillar 2, I will do this. There's also a dissatisfaction about tax competition. And that's also a very BEPS issue, and probably there were no low tax environment, profit shifted to low tax environment. I doubt whether we would have engaged into the BEPS program at the beginning. That was really a problem at the beginning, and that still is a problem. And that leads to economic distortion. I would not duplicate what Martin has said previously. In the end, I would say that we have no other option than succeed. No other option than succeed, because if we do not succeed, it doesn't mean that nothing will happen. There is a counterfactual in this discussion. And the counterfactual will be that countries are dissatisfied with the current system, so that's normal. They will react because they are sovereign. They are a sovereign country, and when they see a problem, they try to deal with it. But they won't do it in a coordinated manner if there is no international agreement. So we will see many unilateral measures, as we already see them, not only DSTs. You have many unilateral measures. you will see more withholding tax, you will see more transfer pricing disputes, you will see more challenge to the principles, and notably the ALP principle, which is not recognized by all the countries. So you will see more those type of disputes. And on minimum taxation, if there is no coordination, as Martin explained, then countries will go on their own. Some will go with inclusive measures. Others will go with base erosion measure types, like denial of deduction. The BEAT in the US is a kind of base erosion measure. But if everyone goes like that, in the end, by trying to address low taxation, we will create double taxation. So that's why we have no other reason, other way, other option than to succeed, and that's why we will.
Thank you, Gail. I'm going to go to Pascal Saint-Amans now, and if I can be a little bit provocative here. Gail was saying there is a danger of unilateral measures being introduced by countries. You had to park taxation of the digitalized economy in BEPS 1.0 because it was very hard. You clearly got a very ambitious project here, but the policy underlying it isn't always that clear. Technically, it's quite hard to be able to introduce these measures without creating uncertainty. The possibility of a first failure by the OECD under your leadership must be there. So what, Pascal, is your plan B if this doesn't work?
That's a good question, and there is no plan B. I mean, plan B is what Gail described. Plan B is plan C, chaos, C for chaos. And that's why we can sense the political appetite and support for moving this forward. I fully agree with you that there is a risk of failure. I mean, we are not overconfident. This is extremely complex, and we basically failed. You say the first failure, nice of you. I would say that the delivery of Action 1 report outside of VAT, because VAT was a great success, but the delivery of Action 1 report was not a success. The delivery of the changes to transfer pricing rules, sections 8 to 10, was not really a success. And that's why we have moved to the next step, which is, can we fix this or not? Interestingly, 7 years ago when we launched the BEPS project, we told businesses, listen, it's either success for BEPS or you will face unilateral measures. And I think that business was not listening or was not convinced. The feedback was, well, let's limit the impact. Some in business were fully aware of the need for advancing this. I can see Will Morris in the room. I remember we had extensive discussions on this. But many, and not only in the US, thought that we were too ambitious, that this was not necessary, that we were bringing uncertainty to the world. I think that was the wrong reading. Uncertainty was growing because international tax rules were no longer fit for purpose. And BEPS was just happening at the time where a number of countries were thinking of taking unilateral measures. Then we probably limited the number of unilateral measures by getting countries together to cooperate and to work on common rules. And we did deliver a number of things. However, on the more fundamental stuff, and I think transfer pricing are probably key to international tax rules, we didn't deliver as much as we should have. And as a result, you can see countries expressing growing doubts and taking unilateral measures. DSTs are a good illustration, but it's not limited to DSTs. You have many other unilateral measures. I think the BEAT is kind of a vote, the base erosion and time avoidance tax by the US in the US tax reform is a kind of vote of non-confidence for the Amsterdam principle. So that's where we are, and that's why we need to succeed. Shall we succeed? Yes, at some point. The real question, I think, is When? Is it in 2020 at the G20 finance ministers in July, where we will be able to deliver a good political agreement, which will then need further time for full implementation through maybe a multilateral convention or domestic legislation changes? Or will it be later? If it's later, I fear that a large number of countries will move on their own, and this is the basis for the impact assessment that we are working on with colleagues from the IMF and the European Union and all the countries. The counterfactual that we are using is, well, status quo is not about keeping good rules which are clear with tax certainty. Status quo will mean a growing number of unilateral measures which will hurt the economies at a time where you already have some trade disputes growing on, and you can see that tax disputes can turn into trade disputes. That's not what the world is in need for. So there is no plan B, but I'm rather confident that we are going to get a solution. The main question being, when is it? The sooner the better. The technical challenges are tremendous, but that's no excuse not to reach an agreement.
Thank you, Pascal, and I'm sure in your approach and your confidence you have the support of the panel and indeed most of the audience. We've run out of time, and it's now time for the coffee break. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, Takahiro, Gail, Pascal, Mohammed, for their contributions today, which will set up the rest of the discussions on pillars 1, 2, and any other pillars you want to raise later today. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
شكرا جزيلا. نتوجه الآن لاستراحة قصيرة ونلقاكم في 11:05. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a short break of 15 minutes. Let's be back here at 11:05. Thank you. Gentlemen, please join us here in the main hall. We're ومرحبا بكم في الجلسة الثانية بعنوان التحديات الضريبية في التحول إلى الاقتصاد الرقمي، تطوير قواعد جديدة للارتباط، الخضوع للضريبة وتوزيع الحقوق الضريبية. Welcome to the second session titled Tax Challenges of the Digitalization of the Economy. Developing new nexus and allocation rules. And our speakers for this session are Richard Collier, Senior Tax Advisor, OECD, Martin Quinlan, Director General, Informational Taxation, Chairman Committee on Fiscal Affairs, and Mike Williams, Director, Business and International Tax, HM Treasury, and Mario Visco, Advisor to the Director General, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Italy.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by asking my panel, what are the problems that are created by the process of digitalization?
Good morning, everyone. Let me try and have a go at answering that, Richard. I think the key issue is the way that digitalization enables a business to engage actively with people, with users, if you like, in another country in a remote way, which was quite difficult before digitalization. You know, for example, you can have active engagement of users on a social media platform. That, of course, wasn't envisaged when the existing international tax rules were agreed, and the international tax rules don't really cope well with that sort of remote engagement with the market, and it's that, I think, that we need to address as part of this work.
Yes, I agree with Mike. I would like to recall that international tax rules were agreed and written well before the advent of digital economy. And what has been the effect of this is the fact that multinational enterprises are able, thanks to the digitalization, to heavily interact with the economic life of a jurisdiction without the need to have a physical presence, or at least minimizing such minimal presence. So the starting point is the inadequacy of the current tax international system to address the challenges which are being brought by the digitalization of the economy. And this has led to dissatisfaction in many countries, to public and political pressure to take action. And this is one of the reasons why unilateral measures have already been taken by a number of jurisdictions.
So one of the main features that have been discussed during the BEPS process when we discussed action item 1, and which is also included in the interim report that the OECD has produced, is that the way in which value is being created has changed in the digital economy. And that fits very well with Mike's comment on user contribution, because that is also a new element in a value chain where you include users as participants in business models, and they massively contribute to value creation. Although the concept of value creation is a bit vague, it's a bit unclear what value creation really means, and you can interpret that in different ways. And there is also a risk that you see just the market and, for example, just look at consumption, because you cannot really deny that consumption is also something that contributes to value creation. You could, of course, say that consumption is being reflected in value-added taxes and sales taxes, but when it comes to the mere concept of value creation, it's hard to defend that consumption as such is not something that is contributing to value creation. Without consumption, no value would be created. That's one aspect. The other one is that the main sources for income generation can easily be shifted in the digital economy, because in particular this sector of the economy relies very much on intangibles, and it's quite easy to shift them to low-tax jurisdictions. And maybe that's the main feature, the main point why Germany and France came up with Pillar 2.
Thank you. There obviously have been quite a number of important developments in relation to digitalization over the last few years. That's led, of course, to the proposal for a unified approach, which is now being discussed. I'd like to ask the panel, if I may, what are the objectives of the current work, and what particularly do you see as challenges to the current work?
If I can have the first go at that, I think that the main objective is to update the international tax rules so that those rules work properly where you do have remote engagement with the users, say, in the market, through, for example, high-tech business models. I think an issue there, though, an issue that we need to tease out, is the point that Martin raised about value creation. I think it's relatively easy to see if you or I post a photograph on a social media platform, there's a clear sense in which we are creating the value on that platform. Without our photographs, without our comments, without that sort of interaction, there's basically nothing there. So we are very active users and participants in that. If you contrast that, say, with selling toothpaste to us, or our use of toothpaste, that has much more the aspect of mere consumption. And I think a challenge for the work is to distinguish between those two And to the extent that users do create value, in a sense that's easy to say. What is more difficult then to do, but clearly we have to do as part of this exercise, is put some quantification around what we mean by that, because at the end of the day it all comes down to tax assessments, and if we can't quantify it, then we are not going to be able to make those tax assessments.
I think that one of the main objectives is to find a consensus on this issue, because only reaching a consensus, a global consensus, may ease the current tensions. So and is essential to diminish the tensions which are pervading the current international tax system. In doing this effort, certainty is certainly a value. Certainty is fundamental for investment and for ensure the stability to the rules that have to come.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think certainty and stability is certainly the main factor, the main driver behind the political process that brings so many countries together to discuss the challenges of the taxation of the digital world. And we have seen some countries already around the world implementing unilateral measures in response to the challenges of the digitalization. For example, the digital service taxes that are implemented in some European countries, that are being discussed in Europe. We had a directive proposal 1.5 years ago in Europe, and we see other countries around the world implementing unilateral measures. And it is pretty clear that other countries would not credit the taxes imposed on a local basis, on a destination-based basis, in that broader context of digital service taxes. So this would automatically lead to double taxation, and there is an overarching interest of countries participating in that discussion to avoid double taxation and to get to more tax certainty and stability of the system.
Right, thank you. I'd like to come in a moment to the features of the unified approach, but before I do that, I wonder if I could ask you to comment on what you see as some of the major design principles behind the model, behind the unified approach. What are those important design principles to comment on? I don't know who wants to go first.
Maybe I can start on that. I think the narrative is a very important principle we need to agree on, because only the narrative would tell you what the justification is to surrender taxing rights from the country of residence to the market jurisdiction, and is also the only criterion that gives you an answer as to whether there is an overlap with already existing taxing rights in market jurisdictions, be it the service PE under Article 5 or be it Article 12A of the UN tax model that gives market jurisdiction a right to tax services, even if they are not performed in the market jurisdiction. So the narrative and the question how the narrative translates into a mechanism, I think is most important.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think we have to be clear in changing the existing international tax rules. Why are we making changes? What is it that we see as inadequate or not up to date in the existing rules? And as I think all three of us have hinted, to us, that is about how to accommodate highly digitalized business models, the way that they have active engagement with users, and to accommodate that in the existing international tax rules, but to do that while keeping those parts of the international tax rules that work fine. As I said, very little has changed in the way that toothpaste is sold or that we use toothpaste over the last 50 years. So why do we need to change the rules that, certainly in the UK's view, work perfectly satisfactorily in relation to the selling of toothpaste? So I would say it's more about evolution rather than revolution, and equally by evolving from the existing system, we are, if you like, modifying something that works reasonably well and something that people generally understand reasonably well. people are used to how the UN Model Tax Convention works. They're used to how the OECD Model Tax Convention works. So it's about building on those rather than just throwing them away and starting again.
Yes, the narrative should especially clarify that the purpose of allocating new taxing rights to the market jurisdiction is as a special reference for the upper level of profitability. So it just targets the above the normal profit. We're talking here of a deemed residual profit, a portion of which has to be reassigned, allocated to the market jurisdiction. And the narrative should be very effective in clarifying this.
Well, thank you. I know the unified approach is, in some senses, quite complex. I wonder if you could comment on what you consider to be some of the more important features in that model. Having now discussed the principles, what are the features or attributes of that model that seem particularly important in the context of this discussion?
I think people have described this as an A, B, and C model. I think people then disagree on, is it amount A, amount B, and amount C, or component or part A, B, and C, but that doesn't, I think, really matter. I think if we look at the different components, component A is I think, the bit that is trying to adapt the existing international tax rules to take account of highly digitalized business models and the way that they interact with markets in a remote way. So in a sense, that's the more novel element. Component B is about improving the existing transfer pricing rules with fixed returns for distribution activities so as to make the rules work more simply, so it's more certain how the rules work, and that I think has advantages for both tax administrations and for businesses alike. And then component C is to a large extent about bringing greater certainty through more effective dispute prevention and resolution to the rules. So I think that the three bits fit together pretty well, but equally I think one of the challenges of the project and one of the challenges that we have to address is being clear to everyone how the different pieces fit together and also how they fit with the existing transfer pricing rules.
When it comes to amount A, which is the new amount, the new taxing right, and the profit that is going to market jurisdictions, I think it is important how the amount A is being calculated. And here we would start from the overall group profit, which I think is the only alternative at hand. Because you would need to look at all entities in a group to get a clear picture what value is created and what the amount of value is. And then the idea would be to apportion only one portion of that profit to market jurisdictions, and for that reason and for that purpose we would need a mechanism where everybody would agree on that this is considered to be a fair amount that is going to the market jurisdictions. And then the next question would be the nexus definition, which would then describe the circumstances and conditions under which a given market jurisdiction would be entitled to get a certain portion of the above normal, so-called above normal profit. I think those design features are quite important.
On the scope and nexus of so-called amount A, of course, works are ongoing, and there is a lot of technical work to be done, and at a certain point some choices need to be taken. For example, as for the scope, one possibility, but there are also other possibilities on the table, is to target high threshold revenues in order to reduce the number of multinational enterprises in scope. At the same time, this would not diminish the share of the global profit, but would have the merit to simplify the administrability of the system, which is one of the key elements on which this old construction must be based. For the nexus, of course, the most important element are the sales. Maybe there is room for exploring if some other elements, so-called plus factors, may be in a certain way inserted in these reflections if this reveals to be not too much complicated. So this has to be explored under a technical feasibility point of view.
It's maybe worth saying as well that as well as saying who gets to tax more, you know, where profits will be reallocated because, for example, of user participation, we also need to not forget that those profits must be somewhere at the moment, and you know, they're either being taxed there or not being taxed, possibly. But we do need to create certainty and to avoid double taxation, to be clear as part of the work, where are the profits coming from that are in future going to be taxed in a particular country. And again, if we don't have clarity around that, then we will just perpetuate disputes.
Sure, sure. Well, having talked a little about the principles behind this unified approach and talked about some of the important features relating to the approach, can we turn now to the topic of implementation? And before I ask you about the mechanisms for implementation, can I ask you more just first about what the important goals are for implementation? What must be achieved when we think about implementation?
So I think the most important point when it comes to implementation is that we make sure that there is simultaneous implementation. That is one important point, because when you discuss a reallocation of taxing rights and at the same time you have the idea of giving more tax certainty, that the same income is not taxed twice, all countries in the world would need to implement the mechanism at the same time. I think that's the most important point. The second point is that with the implementation of the new taxing right, we also need to implement mechanisms that serve the purpose of getting more tax certainty. So, in other words, we need to think about dispute prevention and dispute resolution. The new taxing right would give market jurisdictions or countries in general a taxing rights where they would need to rely on information they would not have in the first place. So they would depend on information they would be getting from other countries. And this seems to me something that could give rise for tax disputes, and therefore it's enormously important to talk about dispute prevention at least at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we will only be able to change the rules by consensus, and obviously that's a challenge with over 100 countries participating, but equally, if those 100 countries reach consensus, then that's an immense advantage that we have all agreed a common set of rules. Equally then, the challenge has to be, it's clearly not enough for countries just to say that they agree with these rules. As Martin said, that there then does need to be implementation by countries on a consistent basis. I don't think that means that every single country in the world must implement exactly the same thing on day one. In a sense, if that's what the aim was, we will be bound to fail. But we do need, I think, the vast majority of countries that have participated in the work to implement at the same time. And I think it would be quite difficult if all the G20 countries, say, didn't implement at the same time. So I do think that's very important. In terms of how would you do it, as Martin said, this is about, certainly under Component A, changes to taxing rights, and taxing rights are divvied up under tax treaties so that they would need to be changed. Equally, in general, you can't tax someone just because a treaty gives you a right to tax them, so there might well also be a need to change domestic laws in the countries involved as well. So quite a big job, but equally it was quite a big job to implement BEPS, and many countries have made very big strides towards that. So I think, although it's a challenge, I think it's a realistic challenge.
one of the challenge in reaching a simultaneous implementation is to ensure clear rules which can ensure the certainty of the system and avoiding double taxation. And for example, there is a clear need to understand how the interaction between the three components of the unified approach work in practice. It is essential to avoid overlapping and double counting, especially between amount A and amount C. So the implementation of this package, it's very important from the point of view of the timing, which must be simultaneously, but at the same time, it should already ensure the clarity with simple and clear rules, not leaving gray areas which may lead to further problems in future.
Well, can we move on from the goals of implementation to what implementation actually involves? What are the mechanical steps that you see as being important in implementation?
I think, first of all, there will be the need to change tax treaties. We are changing the rules, or aiming to change the rules about who gets to tax what. Those existing rules are reflected in the large number of tax treaties, and they would need to be changed, and we need, as part of the work, to reflect on how best you would do that. Equally, I think it's inevitable that, as happened with the BEPS project and the outputs from the BEPS project, countries will have to change their domestic laws. And equally, we will need new rules to prevent double taxation, which again are likely to be enshrined in tax treaties, I think.
Yes, the mechanical implementation, in my view, clearly need a new multilateral convention, which should be signed and ratified by all players. And this brings, again, the issue of the simultaneous implementation. I think this is very important. The mechanics, as is the practical effects on existing tax treaties, could be reached successfully by providing a standalone rule which would not have effect on existing rules. So it could live with assigning the new taxing rights, but will not be at odds with other existing rules.
I fully agree with what has been said on implementation. The multilateral instrument where we have made experiences with now, under the leadership of Mike Williams, by the way, who was responsible for developing the multilateral instrument and very successful in that. We have developed this multilateral instrument. Some countries are still in a process of implementing at the domestic level. And I think we can certainly benefit from the experiences we have made. I'm not saying that this is very easy, but we certainly can benefit from the experiences made.
Okay, thank you. It's obvious from the comments you've all made that there are some pretty significant challenges to be taken head on and dealt with in the coming months. I'd like to ask you what you see to be the future key challenges to achieving a consensus solution. What are the difficulties going to be?
In practical terms, I think if you look at the practical steps we need to take over the next weeks and months, we need to be clear about the design features, in particular on amount A, which includes all the scope limitations. We are on consumer-facing businesses. We still discuss business line segmentation with the consequence that we would also need to allocate profits to business lines. We maybe would also need to distinguish between profits for consumer-facing businesses and profits for non-consumer-facing businesses in the same entity. So that requires also an allocation of costs and expenses to certain business lines or to consumer-facing business. So I think that is enormously important to make progress on those practical steps.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think as part of it, we need quite a lot of clarity, otherwise we will get more disputes rather than reducing the number of tax disputes. I think, as Martin said earlier, we need to be clear on what we're trying to do, which parts of the existing rules we regard as adequate and we're therefore leaving alone, and which parts we're seeking to change and why. Equally, given the three components in the unified approach, we need to be clear how those different components fit together. We can't have a situation where, say, a country claims or asserts a taxing right under component A, and the other country affected says, oh, but you can't do that because you're already getting profits under component C. We need, I think, quite a lot of clarity about how the different components fit together, and also clarity about how the components fit with the OECD and UN model tax conventions, which most countries' tax treaties will I think, be based on. I think equally, and candidly, there is a challenge in securing consensus from such a large number of countries with very diverse economies, and inevitably therefore rather diverse interests. But I think we do have a shared aim in promoting trade and in promoting investment, which implies eliminating double taxation, and also implies ensuring that people do pay their fair share of tax, and equally crucially perhaps from the perspective of business, that in arriving at what the right amount of tax is, disputes are minimised. Where disputes arise, they are resolved as efficiently as possible, and that there is a mechanism actually to get to resolution where those disputes do arise.
The key challenges for reaching a consensus are both technical and political. And a technical profile, there is a lot of work to be done yet. Definitions will be crucial to ensure success to this process, and the technical point of view, for example, we're discussing of business line segmentation. This is very important, but the feasibility and the availability of data from financial accountants has to be ensured and verified in order to give a robust definition to this approach. But the challenges are not only technical, but also political. For example, the quantum of amount A, it's clearly a political decision, cannot be the subject of technical reflections on this.
I very much agree with Mario's point about definitions, which I think are both a challenge but a key success measure for the project. Do we get the definitions clear enough? Martin mentioned that the unified approach looks at consumer-facing businesses. Can we define consumer-facing with sufficient accuracy so that people know where the taxing rights are being changed and where, frankly, they're not being changed? Equally, if we were to decide that while consumer-facing is an important principle in the narrative, it can't be used as the definition. If you need some sort of sub-definitions below that, then again, they need to be clear so that people know what's included and what's not included. Both in relation to striking the bargain, do we achieve consensus or not, but also once we have hopefully struck the bargain, so people are clear what they're getting, so that tax administrations know what they've got to do, and indeed businesses know what they've got to do.
Well, thank you. My questions so far have all been about the unified approach, the challenges, the principles behind it, the mechanics. I'd like to ask you what I'm very much hoping is a highly hypothetical question, but it's the counterfactual. How do you see a world if, for some reason, the unified approach does not achieve a consensus solution? What does that world look like?
Well, I think you can probably begin to see that from seeing what happened with the BEPS project. I mean, in many ways, and looked at overall, the BEPS project was a very significant success. We did achieve a great deal through that project, but equally we should remind ourselves that dealing with the digital economy was BEPS action number one, and implicitly, if it was action number one, a key challenge to be addressed in the BEPS project. But the output from BEPS was, in truth, something that we don't want to address now, we will come back to in 2020. In a sense, that then was the main failure in the BEPS project, if you like, and we are now coming back to it now. We had to start coming back to it sooner than 2020. Why? Because we hadn't fixed an aspect of the existing rules that was particularly being stressed by high-tech digital businesses. And I think, therefore, the evidence is if we don't fix it now, we will continue to have problems in the future. Those problems will reflect dissatisfaction among countries. They will take more unilateral actions, and as we're already seeing, that's then difficult to square with the elimination of double taxation. The unilateral actions almost inevitably don't fit within the existing tax treaty structure, and therefore there isn't a mechanism for resolving or relieving the double taxation that can arise. And I think that is the clear challenge, that's the risk of failure, but in a sense, because that's quite a stark problem, if we do fail, it also is part of the impetus towards success.
Yes, first of all, let me say that I am confident that the unified approach will be successful. I don't want to think of the possibility of not being successful in this. Maybe it's just a matter of timing, as Pascal Santamenza said earlier, but I think that this effort must be successful, because in the event of not being successful, what will happen? That unilateral measure will be flourish, tensions will not be diminished. And this is due to the fact that a possible unsuccessful end of this unified approach will bring again the public and political pressure on taking actions. So I think that there is an imperative to find a global solution which is agreeable to all. And this requires, at the end of the day, an availability to compromise.
I'm also not spending much time on the what-if question, on the failure question. I'm, like Mario, pretty confident that we finally will reach consensus. And at working level, at the expert level, I think there is a high awareness that countries need to compromise. You always find countries that more or less will win or lose in that process, and I think everybody is aware of that. Everybody trusts very much in the process that we in the end will achieve a balanced outcome for the benefit of everybody and for the benefit of the international tax community. So I think the prospect is not too bad that we will finally achieve agreement among the inclusive framework member states.
Well, thank you, and it's good to hear that note. I think our time is almost up. I'd like, in such a large body that is the inclusive framework, even the steering group of the inclusive framework, what have been the challenges with that large body in getting to consensus, or in going to consensus? You might want to give perhaps a personal perspective on those challenges that you've experienced, but what do you think?
So if I may start, this is my first experience in a very large body. I think this is true for the whole international tax community, that we for the first time discuss a quite fundamental substantive question in a very large body, including more than 130 member states. And I think one of the key challenges, at least for me, is indeed to understand the respective positions and interests of countries. And this is also why I'm entering in a lot of bilateral conversations to really understand what the problems are in those countries. And this is sometimes you only look from your own perspective. And I think that is an important point, to try to understand what the problems of other countries are.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, that if we are to achieve consensus, we need to get a pretty good feel for where other countries are coming from and why. And partly that can be done through the inclusive framework itself, but equally, as Martin says, a lot of it is about bilateral conversations where you can more easily have a dialogue. I think a big challenge is dealing with a group of over 100 countries, but on the other hand, there's a big challenge there, but equally, if we are successful, which, like Mario and Martin, I think we will be, there's also a bigger reward. You could do this among a group of 5 countries. maybe it will be easier to achieve consensus. But what would the point be if only 5 countries agreed? We wouldn't have changed the rules. We would have just created, a relatively small unit of countries that wanted to change the rules but hadn't really. So, it is challenging, but equally, I think it's the best and probably the only way forward.
Yes, reaching a consensus in such a large body, of course, is challenging, but it's the only way to proceed, because a global solution must be acceptable for everybody. It cannot be the result of a solution which is imposed by part of jurisdiction on other jurisdiction, but must be a compromise which is acceptable to everybody, every country.
Well, we are out of time. I would like to thank the panel very much indeed for your responses to these questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we have lunch and prayers break for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Please be here at 1:15. I'm sorry, please be here at 1 p.m. سيدات والسادة الكرام، نتوجه الآن لاستراحة لتناول وجبة الغداء ومن أجل الصلاة. نعود بعدها في تمام الساعة 1:00. شكرا جزيلا لكم.